Fostering Innovation in Education Institutions. And the moderator is Mark Brown. He's the professor and director at the National Institute for Digital Learning at Dublin City University. He's part of the Digital Learning Research Network. He's chair of the Innovation in Teaching and Learning Subcommittee of the European Consortium of Innovative Universities. And he will be leading a discussion on this topic. So,
everybody, close your eyes, ascend, go up. Everybody.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and I think I should just state for the record that even though I'm from Dublin, my accent is not very Irish. It's most definitely not Australian. It is New Zealand. We've got a fantastic panel here, I think, this afternoon. It is just turned afternoon, with Russel, Justin, Marielle, and Tony. I'm actually going to ask them to introduce themselves because I think it's much more authentic to hear their own background. So very briefly, starting with you, Russel.
Yeah, so I'm Russel Schilling. I'm with Digital Promise Global in the United States. I'm currently working with the Zuckerberg initiative to create a shared fund for EdTech innovation. Before that, I was at the Department of Education for 3 years as the director of STEM. And before that, I was an active duty military captain doing research and education for the DoD.
I'm Justin Olmanson. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I lead a design incubator, a center and studio for research and design innovation. And I also teach graduate students how to use artificial intelligence in the design of learning applications, and teach undergraduates, future teachers, how to incorporate technologies into the classroom.
Hi everyone, my name is Marielle van der Meer. I am with the African Leadership University. I'm not African, just like Mark isn't Irish, I'm Dutch originally. I have been in the education space for about 15 years, working for a number of different universities. In the last years, I've been involved very much with new and innovative universities like African Leadership University, as well as Minerva Schools at KGI, where I was before.
And I'm Tony Sheehan. I'm the Associate Dean of Digital Learning at London Business School, where I try and support the transition of a 50-year-old business school to the digital age. And so running experiments across the spectrum from MOOCs to just supporting face-to-face delivery of learning through digital. Prior to that, I was at Ashridge Business School, and prior to that, I was an engineer. I'm also a dad who last night spent all his time revising chemistry. So the change in EdTech can't come fast enough for me in terms of new modes of assessment.
So as you can see, we've got a diverse panel, and I think that's one of the themes around innovation, the importance of diversity. In my own work in the National Institute for Digital Learning, I have the privilege of working in the US, in continental Europe, but because of my Southern Hemisphere links, I'm able to work in parts of Asia as well. I have a lot of experience there. And this topic of innovation at the institutional level is almost an oxymoron, if you understand that concept, that we're trying to promote innovation in the core when often it occurs on the edge. I'm going to ask Tony to start off, coming from a more traditional background, to just share some of his thoughts around one of your more successful innovations and any lessons you can take from that, Tony.
Well, I love that line you threw in there about the distinction between the core and the edge. So I think at the core, we very much think about a philosophy of sort of setting a firm foundation, trying to stretch that as far as we can, and then applying that as we look at innovative projects. And then at the edge, I think certainly the most challenging and interesting project that we faced over the last year was a client that initially came to us and wanted a course for 2,500 people across the world, different time zones, different generations. But once we scratched the surface of the issue, we discovered the real issue was decision making. And actually it was almost a challenge of trying to make decisions in a world of very shallow knowledge. So we realized the real thing they needed was to learn on the job while people are carrying out tasks. And in essence, our learning management system was no use to them because they wouldn't log into it. We built the whole thing on their collaboration technology and actually plugged our learning, our content, our ideas, our experiments into their environment. And it was a very different project for us, very challenging, but one that I felt was perhaps the most innovative one that we've done over the last year.
So an interesting observation there, an element of just-in-time learning required as distinct from the type of institution I come from, which is historically much more structured and hierarchical in the way it approaches innovation. What about you, Justin?
So going on the theme of the core and the edge, two projects that I've worked on recently, we've kind of invited the core out to the edge. One of those was the design incubator. After a year of being established, right after we got a new president in the United States, we thought perhaps having a social justice theme for the design incubator would be a good idea. So we invited the core of the college to come out to the edge and think about how could we, because we weren't going to design away social justice issues, but we could think about what were some sideways moves we could do using technology and understanding not only the folks on the periphery who might have felt threatened, but also the folks in the center who might have been bewildered by why other folks would feel threatened. And the other project, going from bringing the center to the edge, would be a redesign of a curriculum for undergraduates, future teachers. And we had them go through kind of a startup process where they had to think about how could they design for education. And these were students who had never taught before, and they said, well, how are we supposed to design things for students we haven't had yet? And I said, well, you're going to have to go deeper into your content, deeper into your pedagogy, and also deep into design. So it was, we felt, multi-directionally beneficial. And many of the projects stood as instantiations of not only their learning, but some interesting ideas for the world of EdTech and for their future students.
Really interesting. Point you made resonated with me in some respects, that we need less EdTech and more design. That whole design thinking and, of course, pedagogy driven rather than technology driven, although in some respects I think that's a little bit of a dichotomy that is false. The two need to weave together. But really interesting. Marielle, you've got a slightly different background, so what's your take on one of the innovations you're working on and any lessons?
Well, so African Leadership University is essentially reimagining education from scratch. So I think with higher education, obviously a lot of the traditional models of higher ed are built centuries ago, and they were relevant for that time and day and age, but not so relevant anymore. And one of the philosophies behind African Leadership University is that it's easier to start something from scratch and build something that is relevant to today's changing world. Rather than trying to invent or change something that already exists. So the vision of African Leadership University, or ALU, is that we want to build capacity across the African continent. It's obviously the fastest growing region in the world, and in the next 20 years, 25% of the world population and the global workforce will be in Africa, but only about 8% of students goes to university education at the moment. So there's a huge need for leaders and entrepreneurs there, and that's something that ALU is working on. So to Justin's point as well, and to Mark's point, one of the core aspects of ALU is that we completely reimagined the learning model to be much more skills-based and to teach students mastery over memorization. So, and really equip students with the skills that they need to be successful in the 21st century. So the model is based on a flipped classroom model, and we do use technology, but not as an end, but as a means to an end to really facilitate the classroom experience that our students have.
I think when you were talking about, if you like, the challenge for traditional institutions and the bolt-on model or the add-on model, which you often see, it always conjures up in my mind that image, I'm sure you've seen it, of the horse being attached to the automobile when it was first invented, trying to apply old technology to new technology for the same sort of outcomes, needing to really think quite differently. And I think you also raised the issue, which I think we'll come back to, I'm sure we'll come back to, and that's around leadership. Just before I ask Russell, just to remind you that if you have any questions for the panel, we'll try to leave time, and we've got the app that you can feed those through, and we can pick those up later in the discussion. But Russell, tell us a little bit about your innovations that you're involved in, any lessons?
So my current job for the next year is to try to put together a new type of research and development hub across various philanthropies. So really looking at seeing what we can do to change the way we do research and development in ed tech. So when I was in DoD, I was a DARPA program manager. And for those of you who don't know DARPA, it's the mad science wing of the US Department of Defense. And so they've come up with basically the miniaturized GPS, major parts of the internet, the Saturn V rocket, Siri on your phone. All of these came from research programs that are done as basic research, but they rapidly iterate towards an applied goal. So what it does is it erases that disconnect that we often have in research between our basic research programs, the way we're funding them today, and the applied application at the end. So what we want to do is develop across philanthropies a fund that rapidly iterates basic research to an applied goal. If you're familiar with Stokes' work, this would be something called Pastor's Quadrant, as opposed to having a basic and applied research distinction. Our goal, again, is to look at moonshots in education and create interdisciplinary teams to tackle them. So rather than say, we're going to fund a project, we're going to pick a program, say, and I think the first one we'll probably look at is real-time assessment, big issue, but really start creating interdisciplinary teams, people who usually don't work together, to work together in different ways to create new types of products, hopefully with breakthrough innovations at the end. Since this will be philanthropically funded for the most part, I would hope that most of what we create out of this would be open education resources, so that it really expands globally. But again, it's this tackling of problems in a fundamentally different way. The other thing that I think is the real power behind this approach is, again, the inherent noise in our research data, especially in education. Again, I mentioned the disconnect between basic and applied research. I think it's going to be inherent in everything we do. I'm an experimental psychologist by training. I see that across the science. And I think doing research this way will actually lead to quicker innovations, more accurately translating into the classroom.
Interesting. Your last point probably touches for me on the burgeoning literature, maybe emerging literature in the area of learning analytics, however you want to define that. But at least in the spirit of how you were describing it, using evidence to understand whether innovations work.
Yes.
And a recent publication came out in the Journal of Higher Education Studies only a matter of weeks ago, and if you want it, email me if you want the reference, but it showed that our research literature is littered with positive bias in what's reported, that the vast majority of innovations actually fail, but they never find their way into the literature. So what we read is all about the successful innovations, and perhaps I'm preaching to the converted here, but learning from one's mistakes is just as important.
Well, if you talk to Jim Shelton at Chan Zuckerberg, his definition of innovation actually includes scalability by definition. It's not innovative if it doesn't scale.
And I guess what goes with that would be sustainability. Maybe that's a good segue to go back down the panel. We'll start with you again, Tony. Thinking about now more specifically some of the enablers. We've actually identified some of them in this brief introduction around some of our own innovations, but just to drill down to one or two specific enablers that you think are very important in an institutional context.
I think it's very important to acknowledge the institution first and foremost. So within any institution, there'll be anchors, which could be about existing technology, it could be about processes, it could indeed be about budgets. So I was just having a very rich conversation with someone outside over coffee, and it's a fantastic concept, and yet because the integration with enterprise systems hasn't been quite right, actually the concept hasn't yet been accepted. So acknowledging those anchors, I think is a very important first step. I think we all have to think about culture, and actually, is there a culture of curiosity? If there isn't, what can you do about that? Who could you partner with? How do you engage? We've talked already about communities of people. How do you actually allow the lunatics to take over the asylum and actually create that energy you need for innovation? And then I think at some point there's also this challenge of focusing down. So how do you get to the real issue that you're trying to solve? Because if you don't agree on the right question, then you don't necessarily come out with the right answer. And as you do that, you can then immediately start to plan what the desired outcomes could be. The last thing I'd say is there's also a big element of process in this. So the way you do the horizon scanning, the way you evaluate the relevance of potential ideas for your organisation, the way you experiment, and the way you then embed that into a consistent, scalable way of applying it across an organisation is a very disciplined process. And if we look at, when we talk of organisations that are creative, Amazon are incredibly innovative, but they're incredibly process rich. So actually process can be a good thing to enable innovation as well.
Some really good gems there. The particular, I think, point you made about asking the right questions. Are you asking the right questions? In my own work, I tend to reframe that as, have we got the right idea in mind? And what I mean by that is the big idea, the outcome we're seeking. Because innovation isn't the outcome. What is the outcome we're seeking? Because I have the luxury of working in a university, and Justin, you mentioned about social justice. I firmly believe that universities are places that still have some role in society to look at an uncertain future of the kind of good society we might want to create. So for me, the big idea I link a lot of EdTech to is the Sustainable Development Goals. For me, these are really important for the future of humanity, and I don't hear enough of that being discussed. To some degree, that links into the work that you're doing in Africa, so maybe we pass on to you, Marielle, in terms of some of the lessons and enablers.
Yeah, I mean, I think also to your earlier point, one of the most important things for innovation is institutional buy-in, because you can have a fantastic idea and you can have a team working on it, but if the entire institution needs to be behind it in order to make it happen, and the entire institution needs to see the value, and the value of the proposition needs to be communicated clearly. And I think as a new university, that's fairly easy to do because we don't have the legacy of systems that have been running for many, many years. So looking at ALU, I think that's really one of the most important enablers. And having a shared vision. And to your earlier point, I think processes are important because otherwise, the idea can be there, but the execution doesn't actually work. And we're working on that at ALU. I think processes are a big thing at the moment. We've grown very fast in 3 years. So, and I think we ran before we could walk in many ways. So that's definitely been a learning for us, and that's what we're working on now.
So the point about having a shared vision, of many change models, some of you will be familiar no doubt with Kotter's change model out of the business literature. Vision is one of the important parts to that. I personally critique that model because starting with vision can be quite problematic, and it might, without wanting to offend anyone, Hitler had a vision. And so the literature around visions coming out of education is that vision is often something that evolves and emerges, and to be truly shared, sometimes it's better not to start too tightly with that vision. Others would disagree, and a context is crucial here, but that's just one of the sometimes failings I've personally noted where the vision has come from the top, and it's not truly, in an ecological sense, in a complex or ecosystem owned around the various habitats, if you like. Moving down, Justin. Any specific enablers that you want to add on?
Yeah, I think when you talk about top-down, examples like ZipRecruiter or Google, who their managers have to, marshal the resources, the engineers to make things possible. I think Foucault has this idea of technologies of the self, where you're more free than you think you are, but you have that little voice in your head telling you, you can't do that, you're this type of a person, this is your label. And I think there's also that in institutions. You have a technology of the institution. where the institution is disciplining itself, but it's still made up of people. And so sometimes it's about finding a group of people within the institution that have a shared sense of purpose, and then exploring that purpose and not maybe acting right away. Some of the projects I've worked on, it took us meeting every other week for several months before there was a sense that we had a sense of shared purpose, and we could move forward. And the reason that's important is because there's kind of a dynamic called, what I call filtration of innovation, where you have this invention, this technological invention that's very compelling, but it has to go through, in ed tech, it has to go through many screens. It has to go through many filters. It goes through a curriculum filter, which is a Tylerian approach to curriculum, not a reconceptualized approach to curriculum. It has to go through a pedagogical filter, which is an instructionist approach to pedagogy. It has to go through a contextual filter and an infrastructural filter, and then also the technological filter. So by the time you take this compelling technology and you get to the end, it looks a lot like what we already have, because it's been filtered through all those things. So going back to the idea of big questions, asking big questions, sometimes the big question is the question in a 1-hour meeting you can't ask because you know everyone will sigh and roll their eyes, but what is learning really? Or but what do we really mean by curriculum? And if those questions have already been answered by your society or by your institution, then you're already constrained in terms of what you can produce, what can come out of your interactions. So being willing to waste some time or do some wayfaring in a space you think everyone understands can be useful. Otherwise, you might end up with something that's very similar to what you already have.
Really interesting. Citing Foucault and the example you gave, I think it's important to recognize that no innovation is benign. There will be winners and losers, and that we need to understand who's asking the questions, who's driving the innovation.
Certainly, and I think with the winners and losers, at every step, if you can set it up so that meeting or that episode is bidirectionally useful. So even if what you hope comes out of it doesn't come out of it, this moment that we've had, this interaction, this next step has been useful in some way, institutionally or for the group.
I think back in the 60s, Postman published a seminal book called Teaching is a Subversive Activity. And many of us at the key face of innovation, I know I certainly carry this as an ethos, that some of our work is quite subversive, with the end goal in mind. There's a moral issue there, but we won't go down that road. What about you?
All of these are great, so I'll just add on 2 things. One, I think innovation in this space and any other space really depends on setting a bold North Star. So where do you want to be in education in 10 years? In a perfect world. So what is that vision? And you might discover in your process, in your journey towards that vision, that you're wrong and it should go someplace else. But you should have that North Star out there and try to accelerate the time it takes you to get there. And along the way, again, you might change your mind and think, we were wrong as information's coming in. But again, it's going towards a goal. And too often what I see in ed tech and education in general is a meandering around. And again, I think we have to take some bold bets on where we want to go and start going in a direction. The other thing is for innovation is it really does need to be interdisciplinary. So bring in people who are outside of education as well. So if you're going to build a team, make sure you have your teachers on it, of course, which I haven't heard much of today on ed tech development. But you got to have the teachers in there, but also have people who work on big data who aren't in education, or people who work on privacy who aren't in education. But have these different perspectives coming in so that it actually shakes up the entire team. You want tension on your team that's productive. You don't want everybody agreeing. So again, diversity really counts here.
Should ensure you have your learners informing the innovation. And that might be today's learners, but the next generation as well.
Yes.
So very good points. We'll just really quickly just wrap up. We've got some questions coming through, so I'll come to these shortly. But we've talked about enablers. In so doing, we've also touched on a number of barriers. But let's just think about some of these barriers, if there's something else we want to add to those that were the inverse in some respects of the enablers. So again, starting with you, Tony, is there anything in particular that you think is a deal breaker, a killer?
I think there's a common barrier for me, which is, I'll call it the curse of unrealistic expectations. And it's kind of fueled by a number of things. It's easy to blame the vendors being over-optimistic in terms of what a product can do. Actually, a lot of the time I find it's clients in the broader sense, I guess guided by the consumerization of IT. So we've all got fantastic technology on our phones, in our homes, in our cars, etc. And then when you walk into the doors of a corporate, it's not always the same experience because there are inevitable lags. So given that gap, the challenge when you're looking at an innovation project is how you bring the expectations and the achievement level, the outcomes together in some way, shape or form. And it could be that you're not aiming high enough. It could be that you can do better. It could be that you've just not had a rich enough conversation with that client to really understand the need. It could be that you've not got the right people involved. All of those can be resolved through a combination of conversation, through visualization, through prototyping, and things like agile development, so that you're iterating towards the right answer rather than trying to do the perfect thing from a 200-page spec that's never actually delivered.
So I don't know about you, but what I saw was a really interesting sort of paradox here between Russell's last answer around or point about aiming for the star, aiming for the big thing you're heading to, but then the reality of not over-promising and then ending up under-delivering. So that's a real tension, isn't it?
But you could achieve that stretch goal if you aim in the right way and you align towards that.
Yeah.
Eminently possible.
The problem is we have products today where they say we've reached that North Star, and we clearly haven't.
Yeah,
So.
absolutely.
And I think the point you made around maybe methodologies. So it's one thing having a great idea. It's another thing knowing how to implement it. And so my experience, many innovations, really good innovations fail because we haven't got the right structure, the right people on the bus, if you like, but also knowing how to implement it, whether that be through an agile methodology or, heaven forbid, Prince 2. But that's a personal bias.
Yeah. No, I actually totally agree with that point. And as I alluded to earlier, I think the idea is just one part of it, and then actually implementing the execution of the idea, and making sure that you have the right processes in place. I think that's often something we forget, or we do as an afterthought. I sometimes also think that innovation, it's like technology, those are these two words that everyone wants to innovate, everyone wants to use technology, but they shouldn't be means to an end. There should be an actual reason for doing what we're doing, rather than just aiming to create a new idea for the sake of it. So that's probably my 2 cents on that.
And in, I think it was 2004, Wired had, MIT Media Review had an article about the difference between innovation and invention. And they make the distinction that invention is the technological instantiation of something that may solve a problem, but innovation is tightly coupled with a social and cultural side or an element. And Pacey, in his book, Culture of Technology, talks about how, thinking about the technology as only the technocratic portion of it is going, you're going to fall down, you're going to keep stumbling in places and wonder, well, why isn't this working? It's when you see it as a cultural instantiation as well, that then you can start to understand that we can't be an innovation, because innovation kind of just means successful, right? Oh, how innovative. Oh, it's making a leap. It's successful in a society, in a culture. And so you can't do that if you're not considering what's going on, who your people are, and do they understand what's going on? As Russ talked about, having that bold North Star and having the right people to go linearly. I think the smaller your team is, maybe you need a little more room for wayfaring to figure things out. But if you have access to spectacular teams, then together they've already done that wayfaring. They already know their domains, and you can do something transdisciplinary.
Sure, this comes back to what I think Tony was saying. We have to confront the fact that our field is dominated still by this rhetoric-reality gap, the overpromise, the hype, but then also that a lot of what we're engaged in is dominated by the language of technological determinism. Somehow technology is driving society. Technology is part of society, and you've made the case that people are very important. In fact, one of the tensions I've often seen, particularly in the K-12 schooling area, is where teachers will say it's just a tool, and it's how you use it that's important. in many respects, that's an example of the dead opposite of social determinism. The tool does matter very much so, and we have a couple of interesting questions maybe we'll come to just in a minute, but finding the middle ground there where innovation comes. I think you mentioned before, Russell, about the tension, having creative tensions.
Yeah, it's really hard to do this after you've had 3 other good ones come up. But I'd say one of the big obstacles we have really are the stovepipes in the existing education system. So, you know, if we really are innovative with our EdTech products, we can start breaking down the stovepipes, you know, between different academic subjects, you know, bringing in our social emotional learning. There's so many things we could be doing, but it's really against the inertia of the existing system. And so the question is, how do we end up getting these innovations into the classrooms? And it's part of the whole scaling process, and the problem that we all have is that if we're really innovative in what we're doing, it's not probably going to be a perfect fit into the classrooms we're aiming for. And so how do we do that? Or it's disruptive on the college side. So, you know, are the MOOCs we're creating effective? Are the students staying in the MOOCs? You know, things like that, we really have, you know, there are certain cultural things that we have to overcome there. And again, the other thing, I came from Appalachia, and you know, we can't, West Virginia in the States, and poverty and lack of access to good technology is still a huge problem, not only across the developing world, but, you know, in the first world as well, so.
So I think you touched on some of those barriers that we face at a structural level, and it links into one of the questions that has come through, because in formal education, whether that be K-12, schooling, higher ed, our students are still, by vast majority of them, doing traditional forms of assessment. It's one of the questions around the constraints that the system provides. And if you're really pragmatic, what you ask your learner to do is what they end up doing. So I wonder if the panel members have any thoughts around the future of assessment and at a structural level, where that's within an institution, within a region or a state or country. How are we going to address that? Because there's a complete contradiction. I know in the work that I do, one of the tests I have of how far we've come is when we still put thousands of students, sometimes in one room, to do handwritten examinations. Again, we'll start at the end with you, Russell. Any thoughts?
Well, we could start with that. So, well, again, my A-level revision scars of last night kind of put my views out there on this. It's incredible to watch someone that's quite creative being forced to suddenly go into exam mode and into, in essence, 6 to 8 years worth of evaluation through written exams. I think there's been some fascinating themes both yesterday and today on this for me, because it brings together how do you understand the individual and their capabilities, their competencies, etc. That can stretch to emotional intelligence as well as skills, academic intelligence. And I think it's a very exciting model. It's got privacy sidelines to it. So the concept of a personal profile that's owned and controlled by the individual, but where you can demonstrate and declare your evidence of competence to potential employers, to potential peers, etc., I think is a very exciting model for the future.
Any other panel members?
Well, I could actually talk to that as well, because so what we're doing at ALU is we're moving away from a model of majors, and students, instead of a major, declare a mission. And these missions are around one of the 7 grand global challenges that we've identified, such as urbanization, sustainability, education, health, particularly within the context of Africa, but obviously those are global issues. And the way that we assess our students, it's all based, because all our classes are based on active learning, is based on assignments and on testing those skills rather than taking an exam and getting a grade for an exam, because a student is much more than a sum of its grades. You know, a student is an individual with skills, with hopes, with dreams, with, as I said, a mission, and a purpose. So I think that's the way that we try to tackle that issue.
Justin?
Yeah, I think when the way schools in the US are set up, there's a test blueprint, then there are testable objectives. Usually those objectives are the ones that cheaper to measure, and so we end up, we can't measure what we really value, so we end up overvaluing what we can actually measure. And so that kind of leads us down a path where, you know, there's a specific single academic discourse that's privileged over all others for how do you prove to the school, the institution, to society that you know what they've taught you or what you know enough to get into the next level. And, you know, something like universal design for learning out of CAST, you know, talks about having multiple ways to entry points and gateways into what you want to learn, and multiple ways to interact within that specific area, and then multiple ways to prove that you know things. And not having those, I mean, fine if at the end you have to go to academic discourse, but maybe do what Christopher Emdin at Columbia talks about as being academically rationed. Why do you have to start in why do you need to ingest a white male middle class curriculum and then interact with it in a white male middle class way and then prove that you know it in a white male middle class discourse? You know, we have one kind of track for how to experience things, and our tests bear that out. And so it shouldn't be surprising that particular groups fare especially well.
EdTech's not neutral in that respect, and in some respects is part of the problem in reinforcing a traditional model of assessment in many cases.
Sure, and as Pacey would say, technology's never been neutral. It's developed and designed within value-laden contexts and with people, and then it's used in other contexts, in other cultures.
Yeah.
Just to add, I think where I would like to see things go is assessment really happening continuously for mastery throughout our coursework rather than at the end of the courses. So if we really are looking out towards our North Star on innovation, what I think we really want to do is real-time assessment so that the teachers can intervene early and understand how to make the kids learning much better than it is today. So I think that's one of the big issues. I'll add one more thing that I'll add to yours. So much of our research today, too, is technology bound. So, you know, we are noisy individuals, but our education technologies, whether it's a VR helmet or a intelligent tutoring system, add noise. So quite often when we see research into these areas, we not only have the noise of the human, we have the noise of an imperfect tool that we're using. So it's really hard to generalize across a lot of these studies. And I think that's something that's going to be a hindrance, actually, on the assessment side as well.
So we're coming to the close. I haven't been able to give full credit to all the questions that have been coming through. There is a question, and it's probably embedded in another one as well, around resistance. That the term culture has come up, that it's hard to expect that everyone will buy into a shared vision. A few comments, and we may have one or two panel members just to quickly add something. Firstly, I think if you're familiar, or I'd encourage you to look at the work on educational change by Michael Fulham and his colleagues, where resistance is seen as a source of insight, not a problem. Your lowest common denominator is the indicator of the extent of your innovation and your success. So it's about turning resistance around. It's in many respects why the Gartner hype cycle is, in my view, fundamentally flawed. It's focusing on resistance rather than resilience. And innovation is more around thinking of an ecology, as I said previously. So ecologies adapt and evolve, and resilience is a really important quality, just as resistance can be as well. So do any of the panel members in 30 seconds, one panel member who wants to just follow last word? Who wants to take the last word on that note?
I have some thoughts about resistance. The critique of deconstructionism and postmodernity would be that resistance kind of pits you against a system that's more powerful than you. So thinking about sideways moves might be useful.
I'd say messaging. So when I was at the Department of Education, we actually hired, in charge of STEM, hired a firm to help us communicate to parents why STEM was important for their kids. And actually the messaging that came back was surprising in a lot of areas. So we need to quit communicating as scientists and get down to the customer.
So we've come to the end. Your lunch is awaiting, but I'll give you just one statement to go away to have your lunch and mull over, and that is culture eats strategy for lunch. So we've talked about culture a lot. Ultimately, haven't got the right culture, you're going to be in trouble. Thank you very much. Hopefully you found something useful.
Thank you all.